Which declassified files still terrify people today? Story 1. During the Cold War, both the Soviet Union and the United States quietly poured money into research projects that today sound completely detached from reality. Governments terrified of falling behind technologically were willing to investigate almost anything remotely capable of providing a strategic advantage, including psychic warfare, remote viewing, mind control, and even alleged forms of telepathic communication. One of the strangest stories to emerge from that era involved claims that Soviet researchers experimented with using rabbits as biological receivers for long-distance communication with submarines. The idea was bizarre enough to sound fictional. According to the story, researchers separated newborn rabbits from their mothers and placed the mothers aboard submarines traveling deep underwater. The scientists allegedly monitored the offspring back on land to see whether distress or emotional reactions in the mothers could somehow produce synchronized biological responses in the young, potentially suggesting a kind of telepathic connection. And the unsettling part is that stories like this persist because they exist inside a very real historical context. The Soviet Union genuinely funded fringe scientific research during the Cold War, especially involving parapsychology and unconventional intelligence theories. At the same time, the CIA was running programs like Project Stargate, investigating psychic spying and extrasensory perception. Once governments started seriously studying such topics, the line between documented fact, rumor, propaganda, and exaggeration became extremely blurry. There is no credible scientific evidence that rabbit telepathy ever worked. But what still unsettles people is not the experiment itself. It's the realization that superpowers operating under existential paranoia were genuinely willing to investigate ideas bordering on science fiction if there was even the slightest possibility they might provide military advantages. And when classified governments begin experimenting with concepts that sound insane, people naturally start wondering how many other strange projects never became public at all. Story 2. Few declassified intelligence projects sound more absurdly surreal than Acoustic Kitty, a real Cold War program in which the CIA attempted to turn ordinary cats into living surveillance devices. The concept emerged during the height of Cold War paranoia, when intelligence agencies were willing to explore almost any idea that might provide even the slightest espionage advantage against the Soviet Union. Engineers and researchers working on Acoustic Kitty surgically implanted microphones, transmitters, antennas, and batteries into cats in an attempt to create mobile listening devices capable of secretly recording conversations near foreign targets. Yes, actual cyborg spy cats. According to reports, the CIA hoped the animals could wander unnoticed near parks, embassies, or outdoor meetings while transmitting audio back to handlers nearby. In theory, cats seemed perfect for covert surveillance because humans generally ignore them completely. Reality turned out to be less cooperative. Cats, unsurprisingly, are extremely difficult to control with military precision. Training them to reliably move toward specific targets while ignoring distractions like food, noise, movement, or random curiosity proved nearly impossible. One famous account claims the first field test ended almost immediately when the cat wandered into traffic and was struck by a taxi, though historians debate how accurate that detail actually is. What makes Acoustic Kitty unsettling is not that it succeeded, because by most accounts it failed spectacularly, but that governments genuinely devoted time, money, surgery, and classified resources toward ideas this bizarre. The project reveals something psychologically uncomfortable about Cold War intelligence culture. Under enough geopolitical fear and competition, the boundary between advanced science and near parody can start dissolving completely. And once people realize agencies were seriously experimenting with surgically modified surveillance animals, it becomes harder to dismiss other strange declassified programs as impossible on first hearing them. Story 3. The National Security Agency ANT Catalog. A classified document detailing a massive collection of covert surveillance and cyber intrusion tools developed for espionage operations. ANT stood for Advanced Network Technology, and when the catalog became public through leaks, people were disturbed not because the technology looked futuristic, but because it looked disturbingly practical and real. The documents described hardware implants, modified electronics, hidden radio transmitters, firmware-level malware, and tools capable of infiltrating computers, servers, phones, and network infrastructure at extraordinarily deep levels. Some devices were disguised inside ordinary-looking cables or USB connectors. Others were designed to secretly compromise systems before targets even received them, intercepting shipments and modifying hardware in transit. That's the part that terrified cybersecurity experts. The catalog suggested intelligence agencies were not merely spying through software vulnerabilities, but building entire ecosystems of hidden physical and digital backdoors capable of surviving operating system reinstalls, bypassing security layers, and silently transmitting data from supposedly secure systems. And much of it sounded frighteningly scalable. What disturbed people most was the realization that modern civilization depends almost entirely on invisible technological infrastructure ordinary users cannot meaningfully inspect or verify. Computers, routers, phones, firmware, supply chains, satellites, networking equipment, all of it operates through layers so complex that very few individuals fully understand what their devices are truly doing underneath. The ANT catalog shattered the comforting assumption that personal technology belongs entirely to the person using it. Instead, it reinforced the idea that any sufficiently sophisticated intelligence agency may potentially exploit hidden weaknesses inside the systems society depends on daily. The eerie part is that most of these tools were designed not for dramatic movie-style hacking scenes, but for quiet, persistent access that victims would ideally never notice at all. And that invisibility is exactly what made the documents so psychologically disturbing once they became public. Story 4. Operation Mockingbird continues to disturb people because it fed directly into the fear that intelligence agencies may have secretly manipulated the very information the public relied on to understand reality. During the Cold War, the CIA allegedly developed relationships with journalists, editors, publishers, and major media organizations in order to shape narratives favorable to U.S. geopolitical interests while monitoring and influencing public opinion. The reasoning was rooted in the paranoia of the era. Information itself was considered a weapon, and controlling narratives was viewed as just as strategically important as controlling territory or military power. Reports and later investigations suggested that certain journalists may have cooperated with intelligence agencies willingly, while others may have been unknowingly used as channels for propaganda or influence operations. Some claims involved planting stories, steering coverage, suppressing unfavorable narratives, or using members of the press as unofficial intelligence assets abroad. What made the allegations so psychologically damaging was that journalism is supposed to function as a safeguard against government power, not an extension of it. The possibility that agencies tasked with covert operations could potentially influence newspapers, broadcasts, and public discourse shattered a lot of people's trust in institutional objectivity. And even decades later, the fear still lingers because modern society depends almost entirely on mediated information. Most people never directly witness world events themselves. They experience reality through screens, articles, broadcasts, algorithms, and curated narratives created by institutions they have no ability to independently verify. That's why Operation Mockingbird became so infamous. Whether every claim associated with it is true or exaggerated, the idea itself permanently planted the suspicion that information ecosystems may be far more vulnerable to covert manipulation than the public ever wants to believe. Story 5, Analysis and Assessment of Gateway Process, became infamous because it reads less like a normal intelligence report and more like something halfway between neuroscience, quantum mysticism, and science fiction. The document analyzed the Monroe Institute's Gateway Process, a series of techniques involving sound frequencies, meditation, and altered states of consciousness supposedly designed to synchronize brain hemispheres and produce unusual mental experiences. The report discussed concepts like expanded awareness, out-of-body experiences, transcendental states, and even the possibility of consciousness interacting with reality beyond ordinary physical perception. What made the file so unsettling was not necessarily the claims themselves, but the fact that the CIA took the subject seriously enough to formally study and document it during the Cold War. The paper attempted to frame these ideas using scientific and quasi-scientific language, referencing holographic models of consciousness, energy patterns, brainwave entrainment, and theoretical physics concepts in an effort to explain how altered states might work biologically and cosmologically. Reading it feels surreal because official government terminology is being used to discuss subjects most people associate with paranormal fringe theories. And that immediately triggered public fascination. People began wondering why intelligence agencies would spend time investigating meditation, astral projection, or consciousness expansion, unless they believed there might be something useful hidden there. During the Cold War, both the US and Soviet Union explored unconventional psychological and cognitive research out of fear the other side might discover methods capable of providing strategic advantages. There is no scientific consensus supporting literal astral projection or supernatural interpretations of the gateway process. But the document still disturbs people because it blurs boundaries between neuroscience, psychology, military research, and human consciousness in ways that feel deeply uncanny. It suggests that even governments were willing to seriously investigate whether the human mind might possess capabilities far stranger than ordinary waking experience reveals. And once official institutions start studying ideas normally dismissed as impossible, people inevitably begin wondering where the line between fringe speculation and classified experimentation actually ends. Story 6, Operation L. AC still shocks people because it revealed that during the Cold War, the US military secretly released microscopic particles across large parts of the country in order to study how biological weapons might spread through the atmosphere. The operation, conducted during the 1950s and 1960s, involved dispersing substances such as zinc cadmium sulfide over cities, coastlines, and wide geographic regions without the knowledge of the public. Military researchers wanted to understand how airborne particles would travel under different environmental conditions, especially in the event of a biological attack from a foreign power. At the time, officials considered the materials relatively harmless at the concentrations used. But decades later, controversy exploded when people learned what had happened. Cadmium compounds are now recognized as potentially toxic, and critics argued the government had effectively used entire populations as unwitting test subjects without informed consent. The ethical implications disturbed people even more than the chemicals themselves. Citizens living normal lives had no idea experimental dispersal tests were happening above them, while military scientists tracked particle movement through the environment. What makes Operation LAC so psychologically unsettling is that it shattered the assumption that governments would never secretly conduct large-scale experiments involving their own civilian populations. And it was not an isolated incident. The Cold War produced an atmosphere of extreme paranoia, where military planners became obsessed with preparing for chemical, biological, and nuclear warfare scenarios. Under that mindset, unconventional testing programs that would seem unimaginable today were sometimes justified internally as necessary national security measures. The revelation permanently damaged public trust because it demonstrated that classified programs can remain hidden for years while affecting enormous numbers of ordinary people who never even realized they were involved. That's why Operation LAC still frightens people decades later. Not because it proved a sinister superweapon existed, but because it showed how far governments were willing to go when operating under secrecy, fear, and the belief that strategic necessity outweighed public awareness. Story 7, the 1976 Tehran UFO incident, remains one of the most discussed, declassified UFO cases because it involved trained military pilots, radar operators, multiple aircraft, and technical malfunctions that witnesses could not easily explain afterward. According to the reports, civilians near Tehran began observing a strange luminous object in the night sky in September 1976. The Iranian Air Force scrambled F-4 Phantom fighter jets to investigate after radar stations reportedly detected unusual activity matching the visual sightings. What disturbed the crews was not simply seeing an unidentified object. The pilots described the object maneuvering in ways they considered extraordinary, changing position rapidly, emitting intense light, and apparently interfering with aircraft instrumentation. One crew reported that as they approached the object, communication and weapons systems suddenly failed, only to begin functioning normally again once they withdrew. Even stranger, smaller luminous objects were allegedly seen separating from the main craft and moving independently at high speed. The incident eventually drew the attention of U.S. intelligence agencies because Iran, at the time, was a close American ally operating advanced U.S.-made military aircraft. Declassified defense documents later summarized the encounter and noted that the case involved multiple independent witnesses along with radar confirmation, making it difficult to dismiss outright as a simple misidentification. What continues to unsettle people is that highly trained military personnel genuinely appeared convinced they encountered something beyond ordinary aviation technology known at the time. And unlike many UFO stories, this one was documented officially through military channels rather than surviving only as rumors or anonymous claims. There is still no universally accepted explanation. Skeptics propose combinations of astronomical misidentification, atmospheric effects, pilot stress, instrumentation anomalies, or perceptual errors under unusual conditions. But the case lingers because even decades later, the documentation leaves behind an uncomfortable question. If experienced fighter pilots and military systems sometimes encounter objects they cannot identify or explain, how often does that happen without the public ever hearing about it? Story 8. Starfish Prime terrified scientists because it demonstrated that detonating a nuclear weapon in space could affect the entire planet's electromagnetic environment in ways nobody fully anticipated beforehand. In July 1962, the United States detonated a thermonuclear weapon roughly 400 kilometers above Earth over the Pacific Ocean. The explosion itself was unlike ordinary nuclear tests. There was no giant mushroom cloud rising through the atmosphere. Instead, The blast produced an enormous electromagnetic pulse, strange artificial auroras across the sky, and massive disturbances in Earth's magnetic field. Even though the detonation occurred far from Hawaii, it still knocked out streetlights, triggered electrical failures, disrupted communications, and damaged infrastructure hundreds of miles away through the EMP effects alone. But the truly disturbing consequences came afterward. The explosion injected huge numbers of high-energy charged particles into Earth's magnetosphere, effectively creating artificial radiation belts around the planet. Those trapped particles lingered for months and even years in some regions, damaging or disabling multiple satellites that passed through them. Humanity had accidentally altered near-Earth space itself. That realization deeply unsettled scientists and military planners, because it revealed how little people understood about the large-scale interaction between nuclear weapons, Earth's magnetic field, and space environments. A single detonation had produced planetary-scale electromagnetic effects extending far beyond the original explosion zone. And this happened during the Cold War, when both the United States and Soviet Union were testing increasingly extreme weapons with incomplete knowledge of their long-term consequences. What makes Starfish Prime still frightening today is how casually civilization depends on satellites, communication systems, GPS infrastructure, and electronics compared to 1962. A similar event in the modern world could potentially cripple huge portions of global technological infrastructure simultaneously. The test became a chilling reminder that humans developed the power to manipulate planetary systems before fully understanding how fragile those systems actually were. Story 9, Operation Unthinkable, remains one of the most disturbing declassified military plans because it revealed that even before World War II had fully ended, Allied leaders were already considering the possibility of another massive war almost immediately afterward. In 1945, with Nazi Germany collapsing and Europe devastated, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill ordered military planners to examine a hypothetical scenario that sounds almost unimaginable in hindsight: a direct military confrontation between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. The plan explored whether Britain, the United States, and Allied forces could potentially push Soviet troops back out of Eastern Europe if relations with Joseph Stalin deteriorated completely. And the timing is what horrifies historians. Europe was already shattered. Tens of millions were dead. Entire cities had been erased. Concentration camps had only recently been uncovered. Yet military planners were quietly analyzing the logistics of launching another continent-wide war involving some of the largest armies on Earth. Even stranger, some drafts reportedly considered the possibility of rearming surrendered German troops to help fight against Soviet forces if conflict erupted. The conclusions were grim. Military analysts determined the odds of success were extremely poor because Soviet forces massively outnumbered Western armies across Europe at the time. Any conflict would likely become prolonged, catastrophic, and potentially unwinnable. What makes Operation Unthinkable so unsettling is that it exposed how fragile wartime alliances really were. Publicly, the Allied powers celebrated victory together. Privately, leaders were already preparing for the geopolitical hostility that would soon become the Cold War. The documents shattered the comforting narrative that peace naturally followed victory in World War II. Instead, they revealed a moment where history could have pivoted toward an entirely different nightmare, one where the largest war in human history might have transitioned almost directly into another, even larger, global conflict. Story 10. The Space Shuttle. Challenger disaster became even more horrifying after declassified memos and engineering documents revealed that at least some people inside the system had already predicted something very close to the catastrophe before it happened. Engineer Roger Boisjoli worked for Morton Thiokol, the company responsible for the shuttle's solid rocket boosters. For years before the disaster, he and other engineers had raised serious concerns about the O-ring seals used in the boosters, particularly how they behaved in cold temperatures. The O-rings were supposed to prevent superheated gases from escaping during launch, but evidence kept showing erosion, damage, and reduced sealing performance under certain conditions. Boisjoli repeatedly warned management that if the shuttle launched in unusually cold weather, the seals might fail catastrophically. The night before the Challenger launch, engineers argued intensely against proceeding because temperatures were expected to drop far below previous launch conditions. And they were overruled. That's the part that still terrifies people. The disaster did not happen because nobody saw the danger. It happened partly because organizational pressure, scheduling concerns, communication failures, and normalization of risk slowly overwhelmed engineering warnings. 73 seconds after liftoff, hot gases escaped through a compromised O-ring joint, leading to the destruction of the shuttle and the deaths of all 7 crew members aboard. The later investigations exposed a deeply uncomfortable truth about large institutions. Systems can become so focused on maintaining momentum and appearances that repeated warning signs gradually stop feeling urgent. Boisjoli's documents became haunting because they transformed the tragedy from a random accident into something much worse, a foreseeable disaster that people inside the system desperately tried to prevent. And that realization continues frightening engineers today because it revealed how catastrophes often emerge not from one dramatic mistake, but from organizations slowly convincing themselves that increasingly dangerous conditions are acceptable until reality finally proves otherwise. Story 11. Project Stargate still fascinates and disturbs people because it revealed that during the Cold War, the US government spent years seriously investigating whether psychic abilities could be used for intelligence gathering. The program focused heavily on something called remote viewing, the alleged ability for certain individuals to mentally perceive distant locations, objects, or events without physically being there. Participants were asked to describe military facilities, hidden targets, geographic locations, or classified activities using only their minds, while researchers recorded and analyzed the results. What made the project so surreal was not merely that fringe researchers explored these ideas. It was that intelligence agencies funded and documented them officially. The Cold War created an atmosphere where both the United States and Soviet Union feared the other side might discover some unconventional breakthrough first. Once rumors emerged that Soviet researchers were investigating psychic phenomena for espionage purposes, American intelligence agencies became reluctant to dismiss the field entirely, no matter how bizarre it sounded. And that's how programs like Stargate ended up existing. Declassified files describe experiments involving altered states of consciousness, target coordinates, sketching unseen locations, and attempts to verify whether participants could retrieve useful information psychically. Some sessions produced vague or incorrect results, while others were interpreted by supporters as surprisingly accurate. The scientific community remains overwhelmingly skeptical of remote viewing as a genuine paranormal ability, and reviews of the program generally concluded it failed to produce reliable intelligence value. But the existence of the project still unsettles people because it blurs the boundary between government science, psychological experimentation, and ideas most people associate with pseudoscience or the paranormal. The disturbing implication is not necessarily that psychic powers were real, it's that intelligence agencies operating under enough fear and uncertainty were willing to spend years exploring whether human consciousness itself might possess capabilities outside normal scientific understanding. And once official institutions start investigating things society labels impossible, people inevitably begin wondering how many other strange programs never became public knowledge at all. Story 12, Avrocar, sounds like something invented for a retro science fiction movie, but it was a real military project born from the paranoia and technological desperation of the early Cold War. As tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union escalated during the 1950s, the U.S. Air Force became obsessed with developing radically new aircraft that could outperform anything the communist bloc might produce. Speed, maneuverability, vertical takeoff capability, and survivability against nuclear attack were all becoming critical military concerns. That environment led to increasingly bizarre experimental concepts. The Avrocar, developed by the Canadian company Avro Aircraft with U.S. military funding, was designed to function as a flying saucer-like vehicle capable of vertical takeoff and high-speed flight. Engineers hoped it could hover like a helicopter while also moving rapidly like a jet aircraft, potentially giving the military a versatile platform unlike anything existing at the time. And visually, it genuinely looked like a UFO. The circular craft relied on a powerful central fan system intended to create lift and directional control. In theory, it sounded revolutionary. In practice, it was borderline uncontrollable. Test flights revealed severe instability problems. The aircraft struggled to maintain stable hover, suffered from violent oscillations, and became increasingly difficult to control as altitude increased. Pilots described it as unpredictable and dangerous, with the vehicle never coming close to achieving the extraordinary performance originally envisioned. Eventually, the program was canceled, but what still fascinates people is that official governments were genuinely experimenting with technologies so unconventional, they blurred the line between advanced aerospace engineering and the flying saucer mythology exploding in popular culture at the same time. The Avrocar became one of those strange Cold War relics, proving that real military research was often bizarre enough on its own to fuel conspiracy theories for decades afterward. Story 13. The Pigeon camera was one of the strangest intelligence concepts ever seriously developed, and the fact that it actually worked to some extent makes it even more surreal. During the Cold War, espionage technology advanced at an almost absurd pace because intelligence agencies were desperate for any advantage over rival superpowers. Satellites were still primitive, reconnaissance flights were dangerous, and miniature electronics had not yet reached modern levels of sophistication. That forced agencies like the CIA to explore unconventional surveillance methods that today sound almost comical. One of those ideas involved pigeons. Researchers developed tiny automated cameras, small and light enough to strap onto specially trained birds. The pigeons would fly over target areas while the camera system automatically captured timed aerial photographs during flight. Some versions even used harnesses carefully designed to stabilize the equipment and keep image quality usable despite movement. And bizarrely enough, the resulting photographs were reportedly impressive for the time. What makes the project so fascinating is how it combined ancient biological behavior with cutting-edge espionage engineering. Humans had used carrier pigeons for communication for centuries, but Cold War intelligence culture pushed the concept into something almost cyberpunk, turning ordinary animals into covert reconnaissance platforms. The unsettling part is realizing how creative and relentless intelligence agencies became during periods of geopolitical fear. Virtually no idea was considered too strange if there was even a slight chance it could provide useful information. And once declassified projects reveal things like weaponized spy cats, psychic research programs, and surveillance pigeons with cameras strapped to their chests, it becomes harder to immediately dismiss other bizarre Cold War rumors outright, because history repeatedly showed that real intelligence operations were often stranger than conspiracy theories people invented afterward. Story 14. The Corona program changed global espionage forever because it marked the moment humanity began secretly watching entire nations from space. During the height of the Cold War, the United States was deeply paranoid about Soviet military capabilities, especially nuclear weapons production and missile deployment. Reliable intelligence was incredibly difficult to obtain. Reconnaissance aircraft like the U-2 carried huge risks, and inaccurate estimates about Soviet missile stockpiles could potentially trigger catastrophic political or military decisions. So, the CIA and US Air Force developed something revolutionary under the public cover name Discoverer. The Corona satellites became the world's first true spy satellites, orbiting high above Earth while secretly photographing Soviet military infrastructure, missile silos, airfields, and nuclear facilities. The technology was astonishingly primitive by modern standards, yet terrifyingly advanced for its era. These satellites literally used rolls of physical film in space. After taking photographs, the exposed film capsules were ejected back toward Earth, descending through the atmosphere by parachute, while specially equipped aircraft attempted to catch them mid-air before they hit the ocean. And somehow, it actually worked. Over the course of the program, Corona captured hundreds of thousands of images and dramatically changed how governments understood the Soviet Union. The satellites revealed that many fears about Soviet missile superiority had been exaggerated, reducing some of the uncertainty driving Cold War tensions. But what still unsettles people is the larger implication. Corona marked the beginning of an era where governments could monitor enormous portions of the planet continuously from orbit without populations realizing they were being watched. It fundamentally changed warfare, intelligence gathering, and privacy on a planetary scale. The eerie part is that what once required experimental satellites, classified launches, and enormous state resources has now evolved into a world where surveillance from space is routine. Corona was the moment humanity first turned Earth itself into an observable intelligence target from above. Story 15. Lockheed U-2 became one of the most legendary aircraft of the Cold War because for years it operated at altitudes so extreme that people on the ground genuinely struggled to understand what they were seeing. Nicknamed the Dragon Lady, the U-2 was designed for one primary purpose: spying on the Soviet Union and other strategic targets without being intercepted. During the 1950s and early 1960s, it could fly at altitudes exceeding 70,000 feet, roughly twice as high as many conventional aircraft of the era and close to the edge of space from a human perspective. And at those heights, the plane behaved almost like something extraterrestrial. Sunlight could reflect off the aircraft long after sunset for observers on the ground, making it appear as a glowing object silently crossing the sky at impossible altitude. Commercial pilots and civilians frequently reported strange luminous craft moving in ways ordinary aircraft supposedly could not. Many UFO sightings from that era were later suspected or confirmed to involve classified U-2 flights. What made the aircraft especially terrifying geopolitically was its near invulnerability at the time. Most fighter jets and missile systems initially could not reach it. The United States suddenly possessed an aircraft capable of photographing Soviet missile sites, nuclear facilities, air bases, and military infrastructure from heights enemies struggled to counter. The photos gathered by the program became some of the most valuable intelligence assets of the Cold War. When thousands of CIA reconnaissance photographs were finally declassified in the 1990s, people realized just how extensive the surveillance operations had been. Entire regions of the world had been quietly photographed from near space decades earlier, while the public knew almost nothing about it. The U-2 became a perfect symbol of Cold War secrecy, technology so advanced for its time that ordinary people mistook it for something not entirely human. Story 16. Lockheed SR-71. Blackbird still feels unreal, even decades after declassification, because the aircraft was so technologically far ahead of its time that many of its performance records remain difficult to surpass today. Developed during the Cold War under extreme secrecy, the SR-71 was designed to perform reconnaissance missions over hostile territory without relying on weapons for defense. Instead, the aircraft depended almost entirely on speed and altitude for survival. Cruising above 80,000 feet and exceeding Mach 3.3, the Blackbird flew so high and so fast that enemy missiles often struggled just to reach its flight path before it had already moved away. Pilots reportedly joked that the standard evasive maneuver when a missile launch was detected was simply accelerating. And somehow that actually worked. The engineering behind the aircraft sounded almost science fictional for the 1960s. The skin heated so dramatically during flight from atmospheric friction that parts of the aircraft expanded significantly at speed. Titanium construction was required to withstand the temperatures generated during sustained Mach 3 flight. Fuel systems intentionally leaked while the aircraft sat on the ground because the fuselage only sealed properly after thermal expansion occurred in the air. What made the later declassification so fascinating was realizing these machines had been operating secretly for years while the public had almost no idea such capabilities existed. When photographs, blueprints, flight manuals, and mission details finally became public, people were stunned by how advanced the Blackbird already was decades earlier. The aircraft looked futuristic, even long after retirement. And that's what continues unsettling aviation enthusiasts and historians. If technology declassified today already seemed impossibly advanced for its era, people naturally begin wondering what kinds of aerospace systems may currently exist behind classified programs right now, operating far beyond public awareness, just as the SR-71 once did. Story 17, Apollo 11 moon landing, remains one of the most analyzed events in modern history, partly because the footage and photographs looked so surreal that some people genuinely struggled to believe human beings had actually walked on another world. When millions watched the landing live in 1969, they were not seeing pristine modern broadcast footage. The original lunar television system used a slow scan format designed for the extreme technical limitations of transmitting video from the moon back to Earth. NASA then had to convert that signal into standard NTSC television for public broadcasting, which degraded the image quality significantly. That blurry, ghostly appearance unintentionally fueled suspicion for decades. As conspiracy theories spread, skeptics focused heavily on details in the images: the absence of visible stars, the appearance of the American flag waving, strange lighting angles, shadows, and the unfamiliar visual environment of the lunar surface. But most of these claims have straightforward physical explanations. The stars were not visible because the camera exposure settings were optimized for the brightly illuminated lunar surface and astronauts' white suits. Capturing faint stars simultaneously would have required entirely different exposure levels, much like trying to photograph stars at night while shining a flashlight directly into the camera. The flag appeared to move because astronauts twisted the pole into the lunar soil and without atmospheric drag, the fabric continued oscillating longer from inertia alone. What became especially powerful later were the declassified high-resolution Apollo photographs and mission archives. The images revealed extraordinary detail: harsh lunar shadows, dust-covered suits, Earth hanging silently in the black sky, and the overwhelming emptiness surrounding the astronauts. And that's what still affects people emotionally. The photographs make the moon landing feel simultaneously more believable and more unbelievable, because they capture ordinary humans standing in an environment so alien and silent that it barely seems connected to Earth at all. Story 18, Operation Crossroads, produced some of the most haunting declassified footage ever recorded, because it was one of the first times humanity deliberately demonstrated atomic destruction on a massive visible scale for the world to witness. Conducted in 1946 at Bikini Atoll in the Pacific Ocean, the tests were designed to study how nuclear weapons would affect naval fleets. Dozens of ships, including captured enemy vessels and decommissioned American warships, were arranged around the blast zone like targets waiting for annihilation. Then the bombs detonated. The footage still feels unreal even today. Massive shockwaves race across the ocean surface faster than the eye can comfortably process. Entire ships vanish inside towering columns of water and vapor. Battleships weighing tens of thousands of tons are lifted, twisted, burned, and crushed by forces beyond anything conventional warfare had ever produced. And because cameras were mounted everywhere, including some of the earliest drone-style aerial recording systems, the event was documented from angles humanity had never seen before. What terrified audiences, once the footage became public, was not merely the explosion itself. It was the realization that civilization had crossed a threshold where a single device could obliterate fleets, cities, and eventually entire populations within seconds. The imagery became culturally permanent. The giant mushroom cloud rising from the ocean embedded itself into global consciousness as the symbol of nuclear terror. Later films, television shows, and even cartoons borrowed visual elements from Operation Crossroads because the footage looked apocalyptic in a way fiction struggled to surpass. But beneath the spectacle was something darker. The tests also spread enormous radioactive contamination throughout the region, damaged ecosystems, displaced local populations, and exposed military personnel to radiation risks that were poorly understood at the time. That's why the footage still unsettles people decades later. It captures the exact moment humanity publicly demonstrated that it possessed the technological power not merely to wage war, but to permanently alter entire environments through weapons capable of destruction on an almost incomprehensible scale. Story 19. Ivy Mike marked the moment humanity crossed into an entirely new category of destructive power, and the declassified footage still feels horrifying even by modern standards. By the early 1950s, Cold War tensions were escalating rapidly. Intelligence reports suggested the Soviet Union was making major advances in nuclear technology, and American officials feared losing strategic superiority. The atomic bombs dropped during World War II were already unimaginably destructive, but scientists were now pursuing something far worse: thermonuclear fusion weapons. Ivy Mike was the first successful full-scale hydrogen bomb test. Detonated in 1952 at Inuitak Atoll in the Pacific, the device unleashed a blast so powerful it barely resembled previous atomic explosions. The yield exceeded 10 megatons, hundreds of times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The footage is deeply unsettling because of the scale involved. The fireball expands with terrifying speed into a boiling artificial sun, brighter than the surrounding sky itself. Entire islands vanish beneath the explosion. The blast vaporized Alujilab Island completely, leaving behind a massive crater where land had existed moments earlier. And what frightened scientists and military planners most was that this was no longer merely a large bomb. It represented a weapon category capable of destroying entire metropolitan regions outright. The visual recordings became symbolic of the Cold War arms race spiraling into territory humanity barely understood psychologically. Governments were now competing to build devices with enough power to erase civilization many times over, while simultaneously trying to maintain political stability under the threat of mutual annihilation. That's why Ivy Mike still terrifies people today. The footage captures the exact moment humans proved they could trigger fusion reactions on Earth, powerful enough to mimic processes occurring inside stars, transforming nuclear warfare from horrifying into genuinely civilization-ending. Story 20, Project Mogul, became permanently tied to UFO mythology because it was allegedly the real explanation behind the infamous 1947 Roswell incident, one of the most controversial events in conspiracy culture. In the years immediately following World War II, the United States became deeply concerned about Soviet nuclear development. Detecting atomic bomb tests early was considered critically important, especially before satellite surveillance existed. To solve that problem, military researchers developed Project Mogul, a classified system using long chains of high-altitude balloons equipped with microphones, radar reflectors, and sensitive acoustic instruments designed to detect low-frequency sound waves generated by distant nuclear explosions. The technology itself looked bizarre. The balloon arrays stretched enormous distances through the atmosphere and carried strange reflective materials, electronic components, wires, and lightweight structural pieces, unlike anything ordinary civilians had seen before in 1947. So when debris from one of these systems allegedly crashed near Roswell, New Mexico, local witnesses and even some military personnel reportedly struggled to identify what they were looking at. Then the situation became even stranger. Initial military statements referred to recovering a flying disc before officials quickly retracted the announcement and claimed it was merely a weather balloon. That abrupt reversal became one of the most famous public relations disasters in American military history and fueled decades of speculation that authorities were hiding evidence of extraterrestrial technology. What makes Project Mogul so fascinating is that the truth was arguably strange enough on its own. The United States really was secretly launching massive surveillance balloons across the atmosphere to monitor nuclear activity during the opening years of the Cold War. And because the project itself remained classified for years, the secrecy surrounding it unintentionally fed the Roswell legend instead of calming it. That's why people still debate it today. The combination of experimental technology, government secrecy, contradictory official statements, and Cold War paranoia created the perfect environment for one of the most enduring mysteries in modern pop culture. Story 21, Pentagon UFO videos reignited global fascination with UFOs, because for the first time in decades, the discussion was no longer driven mainly by blurry civilian footage or conspiracy forums. These videos came directly from U.S. military systems and were acknowledged publicly by the Pentagon itself. In 2017, reporting revealed the existence of several infrared targeting camera videos recorded by Navy fighter pilots during training exercises. The footage, later nicknamed FLIR, Gimbal, and Go Fast, appeared to show unidentified aerial objects performing movements that pilots described as highly unusual. The pilots' reactions are part of what made the footage so unsettling. Experienced aviators can be heard expressing confusion and disbelief as the objects seem to accelerate, rotate, or move in ways difficult to reconcile with conventional aircraft behavior. In one clip, an object appears to rotate while maintaining forward movement. In another, pilots struggled to lock onto a target moving rapidly over the ocean. And unlike ordinary UFO claims, these incidents allegedly involved multiple forms of detection: visual observation, infrared systems, radar tracking, and trained military personnel witnessing the same events simultaneously. That's what transformed the story from internet curiosity into a global phenomenon. The Pentagon later officially confirmed the videos were authentic military recordings of what the government now calls unidentified anomalous phenomena, though officials stopped short of claiming extraterrestrial origins. What frightened people was not necessarily the idea of aliens. It was the admission that advanced military systems and highly trained personnel sometimes encounter aerial phenomena they cannot immediately explain or identify, and that leaves an uncomfortable set of possibilities. Either the objects involve misunderstood natural or technical phenomena, highly advanced secret technology from rival nations, classified domestic projects unknown even to many military operators, or something else entirely. None of those explanations are especially comforting. Story 22. The Sea. A Tibetan program shocked many people when details emerged through declassified documents because it exposed just how aggressively Cold War powers were willing to interfere in geopolitical conflicts far from public view. Between the late 1950s and 1960s, the CIA secretly supported Tibetan resistance groups fighting against Chinese control after China consolidated authority over Tibet. The operation formed part of the larger Cold War strategy of containing communist influence globally, where the United States sought opportunities to destabilize governments aligned with or connected to rival powers. The program reportedly involved supplying weapons, communications equipment, intelligence support, and guerrilla training to Tibetan fighters. Some recruits were transported to Camp Hale in Colorado, a remote high-altitude military training site originally built for mountain warfare during World War II. Others trained in neighboring regions, such as Nepal, before returning to carry out resistance operations. What made the revelations especially unsettling was how hidden the operation remained from the general public while it was happening. The documents suggested the CIA allocated substantial financial resources toward the effort, including support networks tied to Tibetan resistance activities and reported funding connected to the Dalai Lama's administration during exile. The declassifications complicated the popular Western narrative surrounding Tibet because they revealed that behind the spiritual and humanitarian dimensions of the crisis, there was also an active covert intelligence struggle unfolding between global superpowers. And that's what still disturbs historians. The Cold War was not merely a political standoff between nations. It involved hidden proxy conflicts, covert funding networks, sabotage operations, psychological warfare, and secret interventions occurring across the world simultaneously, often without ordinary citizens realizing how deeply intelligence agencies were shaping events behind the scenes. The Tibet operation became another reminder that some of the most consequential geopolitical actions of the 20th century happened quietly in classified rooms long before the public learned they existed at all. Story 23, John Lennon became the subject of intense government surveillance during the Vietnam War era, and the later release of FBI files disturbed many people because they revealed how seriously authorities monitored political activism connected to cultural figures. After years of legal battles and Freedom of Information Act requests, the FBI finally released the remaining documents in 2006, exposing decades-old surveillance tied to Lennon's anti-war activities and associations with political organizers during the early 1970s. At the time, Lennon was far more than just a musician. As a member of the Beatles, he possessed enormous cultural influence, especially among young Americans already deeply divided over the Vietnam War. His outspoken criticism of the war and support for anti-establishment movements reportedly worried officials within the Nixon administration, who feared his celebrity status could energize political protests and affect voter turnout among younger demographics. The files revealed investigations into Lennon's contacts, public appearances, political affiliations, immigration status, and activist connections. Authorities even explored attempts to deport him from the United States, officially citing drug-related legal issues, while critics argued the real motivation was political suppression. What unsettled historians was not merely that intelligence agencies collected information on activists. Governments have done that throughout history. But the scale of attention directed toward musicians, artists, and public intellectuals simply because they possessed the ability to influence public opinion. The documents reinforced fears that during periods of political tension, dissent itself can become treated as a national security concern. And because Lenin symbolized peace activism and counterculture resistance, the revelations carried enormous symbolic weight. They suggested that even globally famous cultural figures were not insulated from surveillance if authorities believed their influence threatened political stability or government objectives. The files ultimately became another Cold War-era reminder of how blurred the line between national security and political monitoring can become once governments begin viewing public opinion as something requiring active management and control. Story 24. Operation Gladio remains one of the most controversial Cold War revelations because it exposed the existence of secret paramilitary structures operating across Europe for decades with connections to intelligence agencies, covert planning, and anti-communist strategy. After World War II, Western governments feared that the Soviet Union might eventually invade or politically dominate large parts of Europe. In response, covert stay-behind networks were organized throughout multiple NATO-aligned countries during the 1950s. The idea was that if Soviet forces occupied Western Europe, hidden resistance cells would remain active behind enemy lines to conduct sabotage, espionage, communications, and guerrilla warfare. On paper, the concept resembled contingency planning for occupation scenarios. What shocked people later was the scale of secrecy surrounding it. The existence of Operation Gladio became public in 1990 when Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti officially acknowledged the network. The disclosure triggered massive controversy because parliamentary investigations and declassified materials suggested these structures had operated quietly for decades with links to intelligence services, hidden weapons caches, covert training, and anti-communist operations extending far beyond simple invasion preparedness. In Italy especially, allegations emerged connecting elements of the network or associated far-right extremists to periods of political violence and terrorism during the Cold War, though the exact extent of those relationships remains heavily debated among historians. That ambiguity is part of what still disturbs people. The line between defensive contingency planning and covert political manipulation became increasingly blurred once secret organizations existed outside normal democratic oversight. Citizens discovered that parallel clandestine structures tied to intelligence communities had been operating inside their countries for years without public awareness. And because the Cold War atmosphere was dominated by fear of communist expansion, governments often justified extraordinary secrecy and covert activity as necessary for national survival. Operation Gladio ultimately frightened people, not because hidden resistance plans are unimaginable during wartime, but because it revealed how easily permanent secret networks can continue evolving long after the original emergency justification begins fading away. Story 25. Hideki Tojo remains one of the most controversial figures of the Second World War because he became internationally associated with Japan's wartime militarism, imperial expansion, and the devastating conflict across the Pacific. After Japan's surrender in 1945, Allied authorities arrested Tojo and prosecuted him before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, often referred to as the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. He was convicted on multiple charges connected to war crimes and crimes against peace and was executed in 1948 alongside several other Japanese wartime leaders. What later disturbed historians and investigators was the secrecy surrounding the handling of the executed officials' remains. For decades, authorities kept the precise disposition and location of Tojo's ashes and remained deliberately obscure. According to reports and later revelations, American occupation officials feared that any identifiable grave or memorial site could become a symbolic rallying point for ultranationalists, militarists, or political groups seeking to glorify Japan's wartime leadership. Instead, the remains were reportedly cremated and dispersed secretly, with some accounts suggesting ashes were scattered over the Pacific Ocean to prevent the creation of a permanent shrine. The secrecy itself became psychologically powerful. Even after the war officially ended, governments were still actively managing memory, symbolism, and political narratives surrounding the conflict. The fear was not about the dead themselves, but about what physical memorials can represent socially and politically decades later. And that's what still unsettles people. World War II was so globally traumatic that even the burial locations of major wartime figures became matters of strategic concern. Authorities understood that historical memory can shape future ideology, nationalism, and political identity long after armies stop fighting. The hidden handling of Tojo's remains became a reminder that some wars continue influencing societies long after the battlefield itself falls silent. Story 26. The simple sabotage field manual became strangely famous decades after declassification because parts of it read less like a wartime sabotage handbook and more like an accidental description of modern workplace dysfunction. Created during World War II by the Office of Strategic Services, the manual was designed to help ordinary civilians and resistance members in occupied territories undermine enemy operations through small, everyday acts of inefficiency rather than dramatic acts of destruction. The idea was simple. You do not always need explosives or assassinations to weaken an organization. Sometimes bureaucracy works just as well. The manual advised would-be saboteurs to deliberately create confusion, delay decisions, misfile documents, insist on unnecessary procedures, hold endless meetings, argue over minor wording, refer everything to committees, avoid taking responsibility, and demand perfect approval for even trivial actions. And that's the part people find both hilarious and deeply unsettling today. Modern readers constantly notice that many of the sabotage techniques sound almost identical to ordinary corporate behavior. Endless meetings with no outcomes, excessive paperwork, managers refusing decisions, communication bottlenecks, constant procedural slowdowns, obsessive micromanagement, prioritizing process over results. The accidental comedy comes from realizing the manual was literally describing methods intended to cripple organizational productivity from within. What makes the document so psychologically interesting is how accurately it captured a timeless weakness of large institutions. Systems often become vulnerable not only to external attack, but to internal inefficiency amplified by human behavior. And because the tactics are so mundane, the manual feels strangely modern despite being written in the 1940s. It reminds people that organizations can slowly sabotage themselves without anyone consciously intending it, simply through fear of responsibility, excessive hierarchy, bad incentives, and bureaucratic inertia accumulating over time until dysfunction becomes normalized as ordinary work culture. Story 27, Pentagon Papers and the later Church Committee report fundamentally changed how millions of people viewed the CIA, the US government, and intelligence operations in general. The Pentagon Papers, leaked in 1971, exposed years of internal government deception surrounding the Vietnam War. The documents revealed that multiple administrations had privately understood the war was going far worse than publicly admitted, while continuing to escalate involvement anyway. Americans suddenly saw direct evidence that official statements and internal assessments often existed in completely different realities. But the Church Committee investigations in the mid-1970s pushed public distrust even further. Led by Senator Frank Church, the committee uncovered extensive intelligence activities carried out during the Cold War under extreme secrecy. The hearings revealed assassination plots against foreign leaders, covert interference in foreign governments, domestic surveillance operations, mail interception programs, infiltration of activist groups, and extensive CIA involvement in destabilization efforts and anti-communist operations around the world. And that's what permanently altered public perception. Before these revelations, many Americans still viewed intelligence agencies largely through patriotic Cold War narratives. Afterward, the public suddenly saw evidence that covert operations had shaped foreign governments, influenced political movements, supported coups, and conducted surveillance far beyond what most ordinary citizens realized. The reports essentially dragged hidden Cold War power structures into public view. What disturbed people most was not simply that covert operations existed. Governments have always engaged in espionage, but the scale and normalization of activities occurring with limited oversight or public awareness. The investigations created a lasting cultural shift where skepticism toward intelligence agencies became mainstream rather than fringe. And in many ways, modern fears surrounding surveillance, misinformation, regime change operations, and government secrecy can be traced directly back to the psychological impact these disclosures had on public trust during the 1970s. Story 28, Mars Exploration, May 22, 1984, became infamous online because it reads less like an intelligence report and more like the opening scene of a cosmic horror film. The document describes a remote viewing session conducted as part of Cold War-era psychic research programs tied to projects like Project Stargate. In the experiment, a psychic was reportedly handed sealed coordinates and instructed to describe what they perceived mentally without knowing the target beforehand. The coordinates allegedly corresponded to Mars approximately 1 million years in the past. According to the transcript, the viewer began describing enormous pyramid-like structures, vast barren landscapes, violent storms, and gigantic humanoid beings living on a dying planet. The psychic claimed these beings were ancient inhabitants, desperately attempting to survive environmental collapse while searching for a new world to escape to. And the disturbing part is how detailed the descriptions became. The session includes references to massive architecture, abandoned civilizations, strange atmospheric conditions, and feelings of overwhelming despair associated with a collapsing world. The viewer repeatedly describes a sense of extinction hanging over the planet, as though witnessing the remnants of an ancient civilization facing inevitable death. Scientifically, there is absolutely no evidence supporting the idea of ancient psychic visions of Martian civilizations. The overwhelming consensus is that remote viewing has never demonstrated reliable paranormal capabilities under controlled conditions. But the document still unsettles people because of its atmosphere. It combines government secrecy, psychic experimentation, extraterrestrial imagery, and apocalyptic themes inside an official-looking intelligence transcript, creating something that feels bizarrely believable emotionally even if unsupported scientifically. And because the CIA genuinely did spend years exploring remote viewing research during the Cold War, the document exists in that uncomfortable gray zone where absurdity and historical reality overlap just enough to keep people fascinated decades later. Story 29, Central Intelligence Agency involvement with modern art during the Cold War, still surprises people because it revealed that paintings, galleries, and abstract expressionism were quietly viewed as ideological weapons in the global struggle against Soviet communism. During the 1950s and 1960s, American intelligence and cultural organizations became increasingly concerned about how the Soviet Union portrayed the United States internationally. Soviet propaganda often depicted America as culturally shallow, materialistic, and artistically inferior compared to communist intellectual traditions. At the same time, many artists and intellectuals in Europe and the United States leaned politically left, especially after World War II. So, rather than suppressing modern art, some American strategists decided to weaponize it symbolically. Through covert funding channels, cultural foundations, exhibitions, and organizations later linked to CIA influence, the United States promoted movements like abstract expressionism around the world. Artists such as Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, and Willem de Kooning became symbols of creative freedom and individual expression, contrasted against the rigid, state-controlled artistic standards of Soviet socialist realism. The idea was psychologically strategic. Abstract art appeared chaotic, experimental, personal, and unrestricted, exactly the image American cultural planners wanted to project internationally. Supporting avant-garde artists helped portray the West as intellectually open and creatively liberated compared to authoritarian communist systems. What disturbed people later was the realization that culture itself had become part of covert geopolitical warfare. Art exhibitions, magazines, literary organizations, concerts, and intellectual circles were sometimes quietly influenced or funded through indirect channels connected to Cold War strategy. The claim that the CIA simply made artists rich to stop them becoming socialist is somewhat oversimplified, but the broader reality is still strange enough. Intelligence agencies genuinely recognized that culture, aesthetics, and intellectual movements could shape political perception globally. And once people learned governments were covertly influencing art and culture for ideological purposes, it permanently complicated the idea that artistic movements emerge entirely independently from political power structures. Story 30, Project A119, remains one of the most surreal declassified military concepts ever uncovered because it revealed that during the height of Cold War panic, American officials seriously considered exploding a nuclear bomb on the moon as a geopolitical demonstration. In the late 1950s, the United States was deeply shaken by the Soviet launch of Sputnik 1. The event triggered fears that the Soviet Union was rapidly surpassing America technologically and militarily, especially in rocketry and space capability. The psychological impact was enormous. Space had suddenly become part of the Cold War battlefield. In response, the U.S. Air Force explored increasingly dramatic ideas for demonstrating American power and technological superiority. One of those ideas became Project A119, a classified proposal to send a nuclear device to the moon and detonate it visibly from Earth. The reasoning was brutally simple. A giant nuclear flash on the lunar surface would serve as a spectacular show of force, boosting American morale while intimidating the Soviet Union by proving the United States could deliver nuclear payloads across enormous distances with precision. And incredibly, scientists actually worked on preliminary calculations for the project. Researchers studied visibility, trajectory requirements, explosion effects, and how the detonation might appear from Earth. The project reportedly involved notable young scientists as well, including future astronomer Carl Sagan in an early research role. Eventually, the idea was abandoned. Military planners worried about scientific backlash, unpredictable consequences, contamination concerns, and the possibility that a failed launch carrying a nuclear weapon would become an international catastrophe. What still terrifies people is how casually governments during the Cold War considered actions that today sound completely insane. The world had entered a period where superpowers were so consumed by ideological competition that detonating atomic weapons on another celestial body was discussed as a plausible public relations strategy. Story 31. Project Horizon sounds like alternate history science fiction, but it was a genuine Cold War-era study, seriously examining how the United States could establish a permanent military outpost on the lunar surface. Created in 1959, the proposal emerged during the height of Cold War paranoia, when military strategists increasingly viewed space not as a scientific frontier, but as the next strategic high ground. After the shock of Sputnik and rapid Soviet advances in rocketry, American defense planners feared that whoever controlled space might eventually control Earth itself. So the Army began exploring something extraordinary: a self-sustaining armed base on the moon. The plan envisioned transporting personnel, equipment, reactors, supplies, and construction materials to the lunar surface in stages, eventually building underground habitats capable of supporting soldiers and researchers for extended periods. Officials believed a moon base could provide strategic advantages in surveillance, communications, scientific research, and possibly even future weapons deployment. And yes, the defense concepts were as insane as they sound. Documents discussed adapting military systems for lunar combat conditions, including nuclear-capable Davy Crockett launchers and modified Claymore-style mines designed to function in vacuum environments. The idea of nuclear-armed soldiers guarding trenches on the moon was apparently considered seriously enough to appear in formal military planning. What unsettles historians today is how rapidly the Cold War militarized human imagination itself. Only a few years after the invention of practical spaceflight, governments were already envisioning extraterrestrial military fortresses armed with nuclear weapons. The moon, something humanity had barely even reached visually through telescopes in previous centuries, was suddenly being analyzed as potential military territory. Project Horizon never became reality because the logistical and financial challenges were overwhelming, and later space policy shifted more towards scientific exploration. But the documents remain eerie reminders that during the Cold War, almost every new technological frontier was immediately viewed through the lens of military competition and nuclear strategy. Story 32. Project Iceworm remains one of the most surreal military projects ever revealed because it involved secretly trying to hide an enormous nuclear missile network underneath an Arctic ice sheet. During the 1960s, the United States became obsessed with maintaining strategic nuclear superiority over the Soviet Union. Military planners worried that fixed missile silos could eventually become vulnerable to surprise attacks, so they began exploring more unconventional deployment methods. One proposal was astonishingly ambitious. Under the public cover of scientific polar research, the U.S. Army constructed Camp Century beneath the Greenland ice sheet. Officially, the base was presented as an experimental Arctic research facility studying engineering and survival in extreme environments. But behind the scenes, the larger classified objective was Project Iceworm. The plan envisioned thousands of kilometers of tunnels carved beneath the ice, capable of housing and moving hundreds of nuclear missiles on mobile rail systems. By constantly relocating the weapons beneath the frozen landscape, the military hoped Soviet forces would never know the missile's precise locations. It sounded almost futuristic enough to belong in a dystopian novel. The underground base itself included living quarters, laboratories, communication systems, power infrastructure, and even a portable nuclear reactor supplying electricity beneath the ice. And then nature ruined everything. Scientists eventually discovered the Greenland ice sheet was far less stable and predictable than planners hoped. The ice constantly shifted, cracked, compressed, and deformed over time, slowly crushing tunnels and destabilizing the structures beneath it. Maintaining a permanent missile network inside moving ice became effectively impossible. The project was ultimately abandoned. What still unsettles people is the sheer scale of Cold War thinking revealed by Iceworm. Governments were not merely building weapons. They were imagining hidden nuclear rail systems buried beneath Arctic ice caps, while publicly describing the operations as peaceful research. The project became another reminder that during the Cold War, secrecy and nuclear paranoia pushed military planning into territory so extreme it often sounded indistinguishable from speculative fiction. Story 33, Operation Washtub, sounds like the plot of a paranoid espionage thriller, but it was a real covert program created during the early Cold War when American officials genuinely feared a Soviet invasion could reach North America through Alaska. In 1951, the CIA and FBI quietly organized a secret network of civilian stay-behind operatives across the Alaskan wilderness. The idea was rooted in the same Cold War mentality that produced covert resistance plans throughout Europe. If Soviet forces ever occupied territory, hidden local agents would remain behind enemy lines to gather intelligence, assist sabotage operations, and coordinate resistance efforts. But what makes Operation Washtub especially eerie is who those agents were supposed to be. Not professional soldiers, ordinary civilians, bush pilots, hunters, trappers, fishermen, and other rugged Alaskans familiar with surviving in remote wilderness conditions were secretly recruited and trained for espionage and resistance duties. These individuals were selected because officials believed they could disappear into Alaska's enormous isolated terrain and continue operating even under occupation. The program reportedly included hidden caches of supplies, communication equipment, and escape resources buried in remote locations for future use in case invasion actually occurred. And that's the disturbing part. The US government was seriously preparing for scenarios where parts of American territory might fall under foreign military occupation. The Cold War atmosphere had become so tense that intelligence agencies quietly built contingency plans involving civilians surviving in the wilderness while feeding information back to hidden resistance networks. Operation Washtub ultimately never became necessary, but its existence revealed how deeply invasion fears affected strategic planning during the early nuclear era. The project transformed the Alaskan frontier into a potential covert battlefield in the minds of intelligence agencies, where ordinary citizens might someday become guerrilla operatives, hiding beneath endless snow, forests, and mountains, while a superpower war unfolded above them.